Molly Schmidt and I'm a Forrest Scholar here at the Forrest Research Foundation. You'll hear a bit more from me in a moment, but first I'd like to welcome Dr. Richard Walley OAM for our Welcome to Country. Dr. Walley is a Noongar man and one of Australia's leading Aboriginal performers, musicians and writers. He's a committed leader in promoting Noongar culture and has extensive experience working alongside Australian and international organisations as a cultural consultant and presenter. He's a designated State Living Treasure and the 2021 WA Senior Australian of the Year.
Ko kela ngara jer wangi nunak nunak jiningan wajak buja ngara mot buja nunak jiningan binja buja wirin buja karijan buja kawa mama jana ngara karijan wangi yai ko kelak bau berawan nunak kot nunak karak nunak buja nunak mort mama jana ngara kura mot jiningan ngara yai ngara jer jiningan kawa. You said, may the good spirit be with us. This is the Wajak section of the Noongar language group. It's a place we call Learning by the River. That's the Karijan Vineyard, a spiritual place for us with many of our stories. It's a place where we gather to not only create stories, but share them and pass them around. And at the end of our presentation tonight, may the good spirit take each and every one of us safely back to our families. Thank you, Molly, for that introduction. Sometimes you think you're a committed leader, sometimes you think you should be committed. So we'll get into that state. But thank you everyone for turning up, and Mama Janangara, may the good spirit be with us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard Walley. So hello and welcome. My name's Molly. I'm a Forrest Scholar. I'm pursuing my PhD at Curtin University, where I'm writing the biographies of Menang and Goreng Noongar elders from Albany, which is a massive honour. And it's a privilege to be standing on Wajak Noongar country, so we're deeply grateful for Dr. Walley's generous welcome. We're gathered tonight at Forrest Hall, the home of the Forrest Research Foundation, and a place where many of us forest researchers live and have formed a special community. Just some quick housekeeping, especially if this is your first time with us. The bathrooms are at the back of the foyer to the left-hand side, and in the unlikely event of the fire alarm going off, although I have heard that we just missed that happening earlier, the evacuation point is down the stairs and next to the river. So I want to pass on apologies from our director, Professor James Athanasakis, who's currently in the USA. He asked me to convey the warmest welcome to you, Andrew Gunstone, and wants you to consider Forrest Hall your home here in Perth. It was a line that he sent me on WhatsApp, so very sincere from James. Also, James has asked me to thank Donna Oxenham, Dr. Walley and the team at Danju Kulin. Danju Kulin is an Aboriginal-led systems change initiative focused on cultural, social, environmental and economic development leading up to 2029 and beyond. We have a special relationship with Danju Kulin here at the Foundation. The elders, including Dr. Walley, Carol Innes AM and Dr. Noel Nannup, welcome us every year to this beautiful place that is Wajak Noongar Budja. This is important for us because we've got researchers here from all over the world, and James himself only moved to Perth 2.5 years ago, and he shared with me that he only felt at home here in Perth after Auntie Carol had welcomed him in Noongar just before their first meeting. With Danju Kulin, we hope that we can walk together towards real reconciliation. It's a privilege to be co-hosting this event with the UWA Public Policy Institute, and I'd like to give a very special welcome to Director Associate Professor Paul McGinn, and thank you also to Claire Feenan for her indispensable support in organising the event. So I have to tell you a little bit about the Forrest Foundation, which was established by Andrew and Nicola Forrest with Australia's largest philanthropic donation with the aim of attracting and retaining the best emerging researchers in the world. We have a steady state of 60 scholars, and there are no predetermined research themes, which means that in the library you'll overhear conversations about black holes, manta rays, linguistics, music, culture, health, and a lot more. Most of our researchers live here. We are interdisciplinary, and our community comes together to discuss, debate, and collaborate. In this way, we're much more than just the individual or our research, but the networks that we form and the collaborations that follow. Tonight's event is really special for us to host. We were all left heartbroken after the result of the referendum. I know personally that I'll never forget the devastation that I saw firsthand through my work with the elders and the way that one of them cried while saying, why? Why do they want to take our voices when they've already taken so much? It was a time to stop and reflect about why we're failing to take so many people with us. Noting that it's Reconciliation Week, today's event is another chance for us to continue this important conversation and work together moving forwards. In 2029, we'll mark 200 years of colonisation in Perth. Albany, where I live, was the first town settled by Europeans in the state. So for us, that 200-year marker is next year. These dates are markers that we can use to fuel our ongoing determination for the change we need across all aspects of our society. We can't change the atrocities that took place 200 years ago, so we must not be blind to the continued effects of these atrocities for our First Nations friends. And by coming together for conversations such as this one, we hope we can create a better future. I'll now pass to Donna Oxenham, Manager of Dundee-Coolin, to tell you about tonight's event and introduce Professor Gunstone. Donna is a Yamaji woman and the descendant of the Mulgana people of Shark Bay in Western Australia. She's also a published author and co-curator and advocate for Indigenous knowledge leadership and ethical partnerships across government, academic and cultural sectors. So please welcome Donna.
Thank you, Molly. That makes me sound special.
You are.
Hi everyone. Before we start, I'd like to actually acknowledge myself that we are on Wajak Noongar Budja, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and those of us who are emerging and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the crowd tonight. It's important for me, because I'm a visitor to Noongar lands, that I show my respect when I come to events like this. And it's part of our education that we share that understanding that we still acknowledge that before these buildings were here, this was Noongar land, and it still is today. Always was, always will be. So thank you for joining us this evening for a very important evening of reflection, dialogue and truth-telling. We're here to explore the lessons of the 2023 First Nations Voice to Parliament Referendum and what they mean for our collective journey towards reconciliation. Just before I introduce Andrew, I just wanted to share that I was also devastated, like Molly and the others that you were around at the time. My grandmother was in palliative care at the time of the vote, and all I kept thinking afterwards was, I'm so glad that she was not conscious enough to understand what happened, because of the journey that she had and all of our elders before her. So these are lessons that we need to learn and move forward on, but hopefully in a positive light. So in that little downer, it's my honour to introduce Professor Andrew Gunstone, Associate Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Reconciliation and Professor of Indigenous Studies at Federation University. He's the Executive Director of the National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice, founded in 2023, and Co-Chair of Reconciliation Victoria. Professor Gunstone is one of Australia's leading authorities on reconciliation. His research spans substantive and performative reconciliation, truth-telling, Indigenous rights, the effectiveness of RAPs. For those that don't know what a RAP is, it's Reconciliation Action Plans, and international frameworks like UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He also advises governments, corporates and academic institutions on reconciliation and RAP development. And tonight he would like to speak to you about his new book that he's going to be sharing with us later on this evening, Reflections on the Voice, during and after the campaign, the first written analysis of the 2023 referendum and a powerful resource on our path forward. Please welcome me to join this event.
Thanks very much, Donna, for the welcome. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging Wajak land and country that we're on. Pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Also acknowledge Wurundjeri country in Victoria, Melbourne, in Naarm, where I work and live. And also acknowledge the continuing and unceded sovereignties of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations. So really delighted to be here. Shame that James couldn't make it, but I met James last year when I was here for another event, and it was really great to come back and speak. So really delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks very much, Uncle Richard, for your beautiful welcome to it. Thanks. So the book I wrote was really based on a number of experiences. First and foremost, it was based on the fact that I did, like many of us here, speak at a lot of events during the referendum campaign. Through my work in Reconciliation Victoria, there were a lot of events around Victoria, in regional and metropolitan, and my work at the National Centre spoke around the country. So I spoke at about 100 events across the country. You know, there's a lot of experience that you have with that, the myths and the misunderstandings that came across in that helped form some of the thoughts I had for the book. But also, I currently conduct the longest longitudinal survey on non-Indigenous attitudes towards reconciliation. So it's been going since 2005, and it's been really interesting to see the trends that come in that. So, for example, one of the consistent themes in that longitudinal study is that about a third of Australians just don't believe that there's any disadvantage in health or education for Indigenous people. So they just don't believe it. Consistently about a third. So when one of the biggest selling points for the referendum was that Have a Voice to Parliament would help address health and education disadvantage, well, a third of Australians aren't even going to get that basic fact because they just don't believe it. So that has some interesting insights as well. And I suppose also the work I've done over 20, 25 years, not just in academia, but working with industry and community, has been really quite insightful to see what happened with the referendum. So I come up with sort of 10 key lessons for the referendum, and I'm not going to try to do all 10 in 20 minutes, 2 minutes each, but I'll pick a couple of them. I think one of the most important ones is substantive and performative reconciliation. I've done a lot of work in leading RAPs at various organisations, Reconciliation Action Plans, which are basically contracts between an organisation and Reconciliation Australia as to that organisation's commitment to reconciliation. Now, if they're done well, the data shows clearly that they can be great. So if you look at the survey data Reconciliation Australia has, it clearly shows employees at RAP organisations that are engaging have much better support for Indigenous issues and support for reconciliation than does the general community. But equally, RAPs can also go really badly. And so there's often a general scepticism in communities that RAPs are a tick box exercise. And we saw that clearly during the referendum campaign. I was astonished to see how many organisations with RAPs did not support the voice. Now, if you're doing a RAP, if you're genuinely going to engage in a RAP, you're obviously going to realise the importance of First Nations voices to your organisation, either your staff, executive, board members, clients, students, whatever your organisation is. So you recognise the importance of First Nations voices. So if you knew that for your RAP, why wouldn't you know that for your country? Why wouldn't you understand the importance of First Nations voices to the Parliament of Australia? So universities were generally really poor. I'm not sure how the universities in WA were, but I did a bit of data across the country. About a third of universities did not support the voice, not actively support the voice. Universities Australia, in its conference in early 2023, refused a request from senior Indigenous leaders to come out for the voice. They said no, and typical of university person, I say this, but typical of university academics in many regards, they said, oh no, we need to just be educating, we can't take a position, we don't want to be political. Well, as Professor Megan Davis, the architect of the Voice of Parliament, said, by being neutral, sitting on the fence is in itself a political position. So that was very disappointing. Councils, local government councils who did a great stand for marriage equality only a few years earlier, many of those local government councils didn't support it. So one of the key lessons I see from the referendum is if you're going to argue for reconciliation, it's got to be substantive, it's got to be meaningful, not performative. And too many organisations, too many individuals, they might wear a trendy t-shirt, might go to, we've got Reconciliation Week at the moment. How many of you have been to morning teas? Not there's anything wrong with morning teas, I've got a great collection of trendy t-shirts. There's nothing wrong with trendy t-shirts. But if that's all you're doing, if you're not actually engaging in meaningful reconciliation, then you're just wasting everyone's time. And what I mean by substantive or meaningful reconciliation, it means going far beyond what RAPS asks us to do, or far beyond symbolism and practical issues. So one example is many RAPs will require their organisation to increase the number of Indigenous staff, which is great, but those increases staff are generally at entry-level positions. You need to have employment targets for mid-level, senior, executive and critical at board level. Many organisations might have a broad motherhood type statement about not tolerating racism, but that's meaningless if you don't have specific anti-racist policies and processes and implications for people who break those in the organisation. Many might have a section about putting some Indigenous art on the walls. Again, that's not as important. That's good. There's not anything wrong with that, but it's not as important as actually making sure the organisation itself fundamentally engages with Indigenous knowledges. So RAPs are often seen as an add-on. During the COVID crisis and back a bit further with the global crisis, financial crisis, RAPs are often jettisoned first in organisations because you really have to change the dynamics of the organisation to ensure Indigenous knowledges are actually at the fundamental heart of the organisation, not as an add-on. Another key lesson is to address racism. It's really important to call this out. I was appalled and disgusted during the campaign when leaders such as Professor Marcia Langton, who I have huge admiration for, she called out the racism that was happening and then was pillared in the media for calling it out. And we've seen that happen since. ABC journalists have been called it out as well. So there was huge levels of racism in the campaign. And what just shocked me, actually, just really disappointed and appalled me, was that after the election, all these non-Indigenous people, politicians, journalists, it could be from the left or the right, they're all doing it, almost fell over themselves in their eagerness to say, oh, this doesn't reflect that we're a racist nation. But in that campaign, so many Aboriginal organisations reported a massive increase in racist attacks on social media. We had Aboriginal parents keeping their children at home from school in the week after the referendum because of racism their children were copying from other kids. A dear personal friend of mine, and Robin, what's Robin? A friend of Robin's and mine, Professor Dennis Foley, he was racially abused so badly on a plane, he's an elder, by a couple of guys in a business suit because he was wearing a Voice t-shirt. The flight attendants had to move him for his own welfare. There was many anecdotes like that. So racism was a really critical part. So we have to call that out. So in the reconciliation movement, when you're organising RAPs and all that, you have to call that racism. You have to address that. It's absolutely essential. And that's not just individual acts of racism, it's institutional racism as well. Another key thing is education. This is critical. The lack of education in this country, the lack of truth-telling in this country was borne out. The questions I got asked, I'm sure many of you have similar questions. Does the Voice have anything to do with? Okay, the Voice did not have anything to do with AUKUS submarines. It didn't have anything to do with paying people's parking tickets. The lack of understanding of what it was all about. The failure to understand that we have since 1967 a number of legislative voices that all failed because governments did not continue their commitment to those legislative bodies was the reason why we needed an actual constitutionally enshrined voice to protect that voice. The fact that since the referendum, the politics between Labor and Liberal and the Greens and everyone else has just seen Aboriginal affairs continue to be a political football, which is the very reason why you needed constitutionally enshrined voice to begin with. So as we move forward from the referendum, we have to really address education and truth-telling. The media's approach to this I thought was dreadful in the campaign. Apart from Indigenous media, Courier Mail, National Indigenous Times, Victorian Aboriginal News down in Victoria, many other Indigenous-based media was fantastic. But as well as the usual culprits of Sky News and the Murdoch Press and everyone else, most of the media, mainstream media, including the ABC, was really poor. The ABC was so obsessed with balance. They would have someone who was a conservative no person, someone who was a progressive no, and someone who was a yes, all on the panel. That was apparently balanced, even though the yes person represented about 80 to 85% of Aboriginal people. So that was a very poor account. So with the failure of education and media, we really need that notion of truth-telling. And I'll talk a bit about truth-telling later on. The notion of issues of equality. I think one of the big things people did not seem to understand was this idea that because Indigenous people might be being treated differently in the Voice, that meant something was intrinsically bad. So Aristotle has a famous quote that sort of paraphrase that. So inequality doesn't just result from equal peoples being treated unequally, which is the part most people get. It also results from people in unequal circumstances being treated equally. That can be a time when the equality can still arise. But that was just too sophisticated, I think, for the majority of Australians to understand. And so what really happened in this campaign is that because people had such a low level of understanding in the first place, they were easily swayed by the misleading and the lies coming out of the campaign. We had key multicultural communities being told by the no advocates, and at the very highest level was told this by many multicultural leaders, not only if the voice got up, they would lose their land and they'd pay high taxes, which everyone else was being told, but for multicultural communities, they were being told they'd be deported. And so the lies that were coming out, and we had the most undemocratic slogan I've ever personally heard in the Australian context, if you don't know, vote no, was a deplorable example of anti-democratic campaigning. And so that level of knowledge and level of education has enabled people to not understand those issues of equality. And I think many people then also, for the lack of education, could not understand the fact that they could still support something not every Indigenous person supported. So many people came up to me, and I'm sure it was just an excuse, to say, look, I can't support the voice because not all Aboriginal people support it. Now, sorry about this analogy, it's a Victorian analogy, not a WA analogy, but I often talked about if you think of the MCG, about 100,000 people fit in that, 8.5 MCGs, that's about 850,000 people, that's the amount of people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait people in Australia. It's ludicrous to think those 850,000 people are going to have the same opinion on a particular topic. It doesn't work like that. And on top of that, despite the opinion polls consistently showing 80 to 85% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people supported the voice, that was seen as not enough by the opponents. Yet the election we just had, where the Albanese government returned with like 52, 53% of the vote, how did the media describe that as a landslide win? So it's a landslide win if you win in a general election 52%, but if you've got 85% support on a constitutional referendum, that's not enough. So there's some real problems with those areas. A couple of other key things that I talk about in the book, and from the perspective of co-chair of Reconciliation Victoria, and talking to my Australian Reconciliation Network counterparts as well about this, the reconciliation movement needs to grow. So the reconciliation movement does not have a lot of multicultural community members. Noel Pearson once described reconciliation as often positioned as a dialogue between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people of English ancestry, whereas 1 in 4 Australians now have at least one parent born overseas. So multicultural communities offer us a really significant area to get engaged. And some of the best events I did during the campaign were involved multicultural communities. I remember one famous day I spoke to an old age home. I'll never forgive the minister who actually asked me to do this. But if you've never been yelled at by a bunch of 80-year-old people, then you haven't lived, because I got screamed at by a bunch of 80-year-old people. They were nearly all of English ancestry. I remember ringing my dad up to complain about it afterwards, and he said, that is why you're never going to put me into a nursing home. So that was absolutely terrible. But then a couple of hours later, in the same cities in Ballarat, I was invited by the Ballarat multicultural community to speak to them, and that was an amazing difference of just the despair and the anger of the first visit to the hope of the second visit, looking forward rather than looking back. So multicultural communities offer us a huge avenue to engage in. And similarly with regional communities really don't engage with reconciliation to the extent. You look at the data from the AEC on the vote, and basically outside the capital cities or the inner capital cities, the vote just plummets into outer suburbs and just falls off the cliff in regional Australia. So, we've now very happy to see that in reconciliation in Victoria, we've been supporting the growth of new reconciliation groups in places like Horsham and Seymour and Morwell, all areas that return a vote of about 20 to 25%. So for Victoria, that was very light. The one exception to that, which is important to note, is Aboriginal and Torres Strait people. So if you look at the AEC data, in the remote communities of WA, Northern Territory, Queensland, New South Wales and South Australia, in remote communities where the vast majority of people there are Indigenous, they were overwhelmingly supporting the voice. So it showed again that lie during the campaign that they were trying to say, well, remote communities wouldn't support it, they clearly did. Another key thing is, and Donna mentioned this, is the importance of looking at UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, we signed up to this many years ago, but the Australians have done very little on this process. And if you go through that declaration, some of the rights, one of the rights is almost not quite word for word, but the same intent as the referendum. The fact that Indigenous people have the right to determine their own future, have the right to have a say in what their future's about. And so we're not doing much in this country at all. In Canada, for example, they have government action plan, and so any legislation that gets passed by the Canadian government has to go through the prism of their commitments to UNDRIP to make sure it's fitting in, but we're nowhere near that in this country. So we really have to engage and reach out. If people had done that more in the campaign, people would have seen that the Voice operates in many jurisdictions of the world. One of the many lies that Dutton told was that this is some brand new concept that's never been tried before. That's absolute rubbish. It's been tried around the world in many different forms and has been very successful. All the academic evidence, all the anecdotal evidence shows that when that happens, even at big national levels, but also at small organisational levels, which are many examples in Australia, it's really successful. Clearly, the data shows that when Aboriginal and Torres Strait people are in control of their own lives, and control of their own organisations, then the results are very significantly improved. So UNDRIP and commitments to UNDRIP is really important. The notion of allyship is really important as well. I find that during the campaign, the colonial label, people often refer to as a cultural label. I much prefer colonial label because it's the impact of colonisation. What I mean by that is any organisation, I assume many people here are from universities, the load Aboriginal and Torres Strait people have in your organisations is extremely high. Often they're having to be, they might have their day job as a computer programmer, but they might be doing everything else with Indigenous issues in that department, and that's really poor practice and very cultural and unsafe, and that went into hyperdrive during the referendum. So the university I'm at, we produced a very comprehensive resources page with lots of internal and external information for staff to understand. But that wasn't enough. So I often had Indigenous friends of mine saying to me, Andrew, I'm just going to the cafeteria to get a cup of coffee. And all these non-Indigenous people are coming up to me and demanding to know what the constitutional issues are around the referendum. And they might not have any idea, they might not have any interest. But that colonial load is really significant. So certainly as allies, as non-Indigenous allies, it's up to us to address racism. If you're at a meeting with someone saying a racist comment, you're not turning to your Aboriginal colleague, you've got to address that yourself. So there's a real responsibility, which I think the referendum showed that we failed to do as a country. So to have a substantive reconciliation process moving forward, you need to take those important steps. And one of the really key lessons also is the notion to recommit to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So hands up who's read the Uluru Statement. Quite a few. To me, it's one of the most profoundly beautiful statements I've ever read. It's a very emotional statement. It's incredibly generous. It's inviting all of Australia to walk with Aboriginal and Torres Strait people for voice, truth and truth. It's incredibly generous. And it's a different approach from what's previously been done. Many political campaigns in the past have petitioned kings and queens of England, petitioned Governor-Generals of Australia. This was an appeal not to Parliament, not to kings and queens, but to the Australian people. And remember, it was devised and developed by the largest gathering of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people in Australia's history at Uluru in 2017. So this is an incredibly generous invitation. And I think we need to, as non-Indigenous allies, to see that in that context and to have a better understanding why, to this day, many Aboriginal and Torres Strait people are devastated by the referendum result. Most non-Indigenous people, particularly those that voted no, just moved on the next day. But it's been really hard to move on for so many people because it's the rejection not by the government, it's a rejection by non-Indigenous workmates and friends and family members and people they might be playing sport with. So it's a much more personal rejection. So as allies, we need to be much better at recommitting. My organisation's Reconciliation Victoria and the National Centre, we're very committed to implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart in whatever way we can do. But very sadly, after the referendum, despite the referendum being about the voice, and that was it, lots of governments around Australia and oppositions around Australia started reneging on their previous commitments. So within that week, most governments and oppositions around Australia had said they're no longer going to engage in treaty or truth making. So that's been a really poor result. Albanese has pulled back. Remember in May 2022, and he stood up and said he commits his government to implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. That was a really great moment to see. He's reneged on that completely. And so in Garma last year, we had the unedifying sight of a white man, whether he's a Prime Minister or not, he's a white man trying to explain what Makarrata means at Garma in front of Yolngu people, and Makarrata is a Yolngu word. because he's trying to turn it around to not. Uller's statement talks about a Makarrata commission to implement a process of agreement making and truth telling, and he's trying to say much more about personal stuff. But it's what it is what's written down there. So we desperately need a national treaty. We're the only former British colony that doesn't have a treaty. We desperately need a national truth-telling body. But it's very sporadic because it's not being done at a national level, so it's up to the states. So I know in West Australia, close colleagues with Jodie Nunn, and she's talked a lot about some of the work that people in this state are doing on truth-telling. In South Australia, they have a legislative voice to Parliament. New South Wales, they've started on the process of consultation with the treaty. But in Queensland and in Northern Territory, Conservative governments that have been elected have reneged on previous commitments and have pulled back from treaty and truth-telling. And the absolutely shameful episode in Queensland with Josh Creamer, an amazing Indigenous leader who was leading the truth-telling inquiry there, doing some exceptional work. New government comes in and they just pulled the pin. I mean, who doesn't want to see truth? So the truth-telling inquiry, the Treaty Commission in Queensland has been abolished. Tasmania has just announced that they will have a truth process, but explicitly the government's ruled out a treaty. Now, I know this is going to sound parochial, I'll try not to be, but only in Victoria are we actually implementing voice, treaty and truth. So we've had the first People's Assembly in Victoria for a number of years, and that is a democratically elected body of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders. That's the voice component, that's already working. Treaty is being currently conducted between the first People's Assembly and the Victorian Government under the umbrella of an umpire called the Treaty Authority. We will have a treaty in Victoria by either the end of the year or early next year, and that's extremely exciting. However, the next state election is in October 2026, and the opposition, sniffing the wind, has decided to be opportunistic about it. Where's that? Kicking the political football again. And they've said not only will they will abolish the treaty, they'll abolish the First People's Assembly. And so there's a real effort to try to get a treaty in Victoria, so we can see that the sky doesn't fall in when that happens. And of course, the Europe Justice Commission. The Europe Justice Commission is Australia's first truth-telling body, and they have been doing some exceptional work over the past 2 years. They're about to hand their official report into the government. They've got the powers of the Royal Commission, and that'll be handed in June. And that report will help inform what the treaty is going to be doing. So we, at a whole range of different levels, have to recommit to voice, treaty and truth. And I'm talking a lot about it at a broad institutional level, at a government level, but organisations can do things as well. So Professor Marcia Langton, Professor Barry Judd, two colleagues of mine at University of Melbourne, they've been leading some great work on truth-telling at University of Melbourne. University of Melbourne, for a number of years in the 20th century, pretty much housed most of the eugenicists in this country. And those eugenicists had buildings named after them. And so they've produced a book to document this, and that caused a bit of ruckus, even that long ago, still caused some ruckus, and a renaming building. So we can all do our bit at organisational levels as well. So it's really important as allies to look at this. So moving forward, a genuine reconciliation process, what we want to see following the referendum, is one where we can really address that institutional racism, we can address the ignorance and the lack of understanding through genuine truth-telling. But we need to go beyond that. So the Europe Justice Commission, for example, has already released two fantastic reports, one addressing criminal justice and one addressing out-of-home care. So I've just given some bouquets to Victoria, now I'm giving a brickbat. Victoria actually has the highest rate of out-of-home care removals in Australia. The Europe Justice Commission had some fantastic recommendations, and the Victorian government's just sat on them. And we all know what that's like. In my field of education, there are dozens of reports the governments have done over the years that have never been implemented. So truth-telling is not enough. Truth-telling needs to be followed by truth listening. If it's just truth-telling, all that's doing is re-traumatising Indigenous people, telling us the same stories again and again. That's important to have truth-telling, obviously, but non-Indigenous people need to listen, and then importantly, governments, individuals need to act. So Victorian government, if it's going to be true to its word that's going to support truth-telling, it needs to act on what Indigenous leaders are telling the Victorian government needs to be done. So that truth listening, truth and acting is really critical as well. And then we need a treaty. Desperately need a treaty in this country. I think one of the things that probably went wrong in terms of the campaign with the referendum was we didn't, as those of us proponents that were arguing for it, probably didn't explain well enough how a voice would have benefited all of Australia. I think there was a lot of talk about how it would benefit Indigenous people, which it would have. But just like a RAP, a genuine RAP is not just about benefiting Indigenous people in an organisation by creating more employment, procurement. a good rap will actually change the culture of the organisation and make the organisation better for everyone. Just in that vein, the voice to Parliament would have made the country a better place. And I don't think we probably solved that enough, because I think that would have given more non-Indigenous people the skin in the game. And I think we need to look at that for treaty. A treaty, in my mind, would absolutely benefit the whole country. Some of the work that Indigenous leaders have been doing is really important to note that benefits the whole community. So one example is First Nations leaders have been campaigning in Victoria for decades, literally decades. The Royal Commission to Aboriginals in Custody in 1991 released a report, 399 recommendations. The vast majority, by the way, have never been implemented across the country. And one of those recommendations was to decriminalise public drunkenness in recognition that the police were often abusing their powers and targeting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth. That finally got decriminalised last year in Victoria, more than 30 years later. But the benefit of that advocacy from Indigenous leaders is not just for Indigenous people, it's for any marginalised group that the police will want to target. So a whole range of different marginalised groups are going to benefit from that. The work that Aboriginal leaders are doing on out-of-home care and child removals is going to benefit lots of other groups as well. So I think that's the important way to sell the treaty. But we're a long way short of having a treaty for the country. But I certainly argue, I wrote an opinion piece just today, arguing the Albanese government has a mandate now. There's an overwhelming mandate to actually be braver in its policy decisions. Of course we need to address health and education. Of course we need to do that. But we need to do far more than just practical measures. Health and education issues can be argued as being distributive justice, and that's important. But the broader notion of justice, reparative justice, so stolen generations compensation schemes, stolen wages compensation schemes, genuine reparative issues, that needs to be addressed as well. How am I going for time? Is that? Yeah. So that's a really key part, I think, for the notion of getting genuine justice in this country as well. So, to me, the appalling racism in the last couple of weeks of the election campaign, where you had many conservatives saying that they were denigrating the flags, denigrating welcomes to the country. You had the racism, I believe, that happened in Perth as well. An elder got booed here, got booed in Melbourne. The Melbourne Storm then decided to cancel a welcome to country booked with one of the most esteemed Warrantry elders, Aunty Joy Murphy-Wondon. So they're all examples of those sort of culture wars that the opposition was so keen to fight. Now, I'm sure that was rejected. The opposition was rejected on a number of grounds, but I think one of the keys it was rejected is because Australians don't want those Trump-style policies here. And so I think that's a really important thing for us to look forward. One of the things I did want to sort of finish on, I suppose, is it's important to note what's happened since the referendum. Since the referendum, there's been an increase in racism. Now, whether there's an increase of racism or an increase in people feeling comfortable to do that, but we see that all around the country. Certainly from the perspective of a reconciliation leader, we hear that from our local reconciliation groups all the time. More elders are getting booed during welcomes. This doesn't just happen on Anzac Day, it happens continually. Many non-Indigenous people have got booed during acknowledgement of the country. We have local councils. I know there's some in West Australia, South Australia, Victoria that have reneged on previous commitments on not to celebrate the 26th of January, to have Survival Day events. Councils are pulling back from that. Councils are pulling back from doing acknowledgements, displaying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags. And I think that's a thing, and from what I've heard a lot of people talk about when they're arguing is people will say, well, we voted no in the referendum. Well, yes, people overwhelmingly voted no, tragically, to a voice to Parliament, but they didn't vote no to everything else. And I think there's some bad actors in this who are using that result on a specific public policy to extrapolate that to attack all the gains we've won in the reconciliation movement over the last 30 years. So that's something that's incumbent on us as reconciliation advocates to push back and to push back hard. And so I've certainly been inspired by the work of local reconciliation groups around the country. It's been incredible to see so many local groups set up. In Victoria, we've gone from about 20 local reconciliation groups to about 40 since the referendum, and not just in Melbourne, but in other areas as well. And they're doing some terrific local truth-telling and local reconciliation work, and that's making a big difference, particularly in those communities that returned a strong no vote. So that's one reason that gives me hope, is the commitment of reconciliation supporters. And the other reason that gives me hope is the leadership of First Nations people across the country. So all these amazing initiatives, in Victoria, obviously the Voice Treaty and Truth, but everywhere else as well. The recent announcement by the Cook government to finally have a stolen generation compensation scheme. that would not have happened without so much leadership from First Nations leaders like Uncle Jim and Tony and many others who I've been privileged to work with for a number of years. And that amazing documentary, I'm sure many have seen here, Genocide of the Wildflower State, all that advocacy going back many, many years has what's led to today. Because as you probably know, Western Australia was one of only 2 governments not to have a stolen generation scheme. Now that dubious honour resides with Queensland. And so, sorry?
Didn't they just announce it?
Queensland hasn't, no,
No, WA.
that's what I'm saying. Western Australia's just announced it, so now it's just Queensland. So, and so that's really important to note that you know, there's a lot of despair around, understandably, but those are the 2 things that give me hope. The leadership of First Nations political activists and academics and leaders, and the strong support from reconciliation groups around the country as well, because we have to genuinely engage in that substantive process rather than looking at formal process. Happy to leave it now and do the panel. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was amazing. I'd like Richard to come up to one of the chairs. We'd like to have a conversation. Just reflect on quite a lot of what you've just discussed with the audience tonight. I'm just wondering if you guys have an opinion. In the wake of the referendum, how do we begin to rebuild momentum and trust across the communities? Anyone?
I thought we might have an audience with you.
Shall I repeat the question? In the wake of the referendum, how do we begin to rebuild momentum and trust across communities?
Well, I'm a firm believer that Australians and Australia is a decent place for decent people. That's my belief. I firmly believe, I used to say 80% of Australians are very decent. You can divide the others into those who are decent on steroids. They do exceptional work. And then you've got the negative side. But those at that pinnacle, what people say the extremists on both sides are in the smaller majority. That's my belief. And with that, it gives us great faith in the next generations. If I would have said this 20 years ago, I would have said 70% of people are decent people. 60 years ago, I would have said 50%. 200 years ago, I said, well, 3 or 4 of them are pretty decent. So you can see if the numbers are increasing, particularly younger people now want to know. They want to know truth. And they're not making comparatives now in their backyard, they're making international and national comparatives, which is fantastic. And that's where truth comes out. So I firmly believe that we're in a healthy place. We just have to have that wonderful word truth as a part of the conversation. And those who I was asked the question when they had the inquiry into having a truth forum from led by the Greens at that stage. And my opinion is governments are not the people who run truth forums, because they don't run truth very well. They're twisters and benders and distorters of truth. So it's got to be done by independent groups. And that makes it difficult, because to do those, there's got to be resources behind it. So I believe conversations like these stimulates interest and stimulates other conversations, so that we may have 60 or 70 here, which will talk to another 200 by tomorrow. So that's how I firmly believe that growth from a ground swell, I believe is healthy. That's me. I may be an optimist, but I firmly believe that this is a decent place, decent people, and we mustn't let those who have got extremes on either side hijack the debate.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you about the importance of that the young are very supportive. Like my kids, my younger two are 17, and they just didn't get what the fuss was about, and all their friends are the same. So I was desperately hoping that we could have a constitutional referendum to lower the voting age for this referendum, because to me, and maybe cut it off at some other age, but you're looking at kids at 16 and that sort of age group when my two youngest were at that stage. Yeah, they just didn't see the fuss, and so it was just as you got older. But look, there's some great older people who campaign. My dad is 85 in a couple of months. He was out letterboxing for the referendum. So there's a lot of goodwill amongst all groups. But certainly the trend was, as you got older, the less likely to be supporting this. So yeah, absolutely. I think the youth are real hope. I think there's probably some things we need to change, like the truth in political advertising laws need to be changed, because the no case was just full of outright lies, and there was nothing the ANC could about. So we need to try to have that changed. I think really, there's only 8 out of 44 referendums ever been passed, and no referendum's ever been passed that hasn't been bipartisan support. So I think we don't have to, we shouldn't discount the fact that by an act of political bastardry, the Nationals and the Liberals did this to just get political mileage from Labor, and that pretty much doomed the referendum from that point. Probably important to note that Peter Dutton lost an election, a by-election in Victoria, in outer Melbourne, on a Saturday. I think it was the 1st of April. And that was the first time an opposition lost a by-election to a government in over 100 years. And surprise, surprise, 3 days later, he led the party room in a surprise move to oppose the referendum. Can't see any connection there. But certainly distracted the media attention from his leadership. So there's a whole range of, I think, structural things we need to do. But yeah, I do have hope from, as I said, with a lot of the local reconciliation groups are doing some amazing work. And I agree with you that there are limitations of what a government inquiry and truth telling can do. That's why I think community truth telling is really important. Just a quick little plug. I was going to say this at some point. The National Centre is working with Murdoch University and Reconciliation WA to have a truth, Reconciliation Truth Forum this Friday. So I've left some flyers out the front, and so we see truth telling is really important for a substantive reconciliation process, because as we both talked about, you're not going to get justice without truth.
Thank you. So, with the referendum and the No campaign, they were really quite emphatic that Aboriginal people were not supportive of the Voice, even though we were. So, in hindsight, what does meaningful consultation with First Nations communities look like, and where are we still falling short, in your opinion? Sorry.
In the past, there was 1 or 2 means of communications on a large scale, and they were mostly run by people who had commercial agendas. So if anything wasn't commercial or a threat to their commercial agenda, it didn't get any coverage. So what's happening now is with the agenda changing and the medium's changing, a lot more information and disinformation is getting out that's not controlled by the commercial. Now it's controlled by fundamentalists or people with other agendas. So it's becoming more cloudy now, whereas in the past, we used to have that standard joke that Aboriginal people made their newspapers for political activism and sport. We're getting some in business now. We're getting some in the academic world and in the medical world. So I think these other mediums now are contributing to again a brighter future. So I think the challenge we have now is to structure what we believe people can comprehend in their own world. Because you can only compare it to your own world. People who have never met with Aboriginal people or mixed race people, very difficult for them to have a comprehension of what they're speaking about. People who've never had a member of their family taken away can't understand what people are speaking about, those who have. So it's all these opportunities, I call them, of understanding that in the past was not published, whereas now we've got even forums like this, people can video and take information, and people got access to, as I said, 60 you talk to 200. Some can talk to 500, 600 or 1,000 because they've got them on the, what do you call it, your LinkedIn? Social media. I've got grandkids, thank goodness I chuck my phone too, so they help me out. But I'm not a social media person. I'm from the old school of, I believe in personal contact and speaking with people, picking up energies, and that's still a wonderful thing. So, but the new media is an opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question about the consultation, because I think we can see examples like in a university context. I mean, research is often seen in communities as a really dirty work for good reason, because research at universities are often exploited, and still do to some extent, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities for their own purposes. And yet I've sat on my fair share, probably too many of them over the years, of human research ethics committees, and you often get examples of non-Indigenous academics that they, their idea of consultation is to talk to one uncle that they might know who's not even any connection to the community, let alone a significant figure there, and they don't go through the proper process. And so we have got better, I think, over the years. We've got the AITS's Code of Ethics, we've got a bunch more processes. But of course that doesn't play out in the political field, and so I think, as I was saying in my speech, one of the problems I think we faced as a movement in that referendum was too many non-Indigenous people use the excuse, pretty much Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine was saying no, so we can't disagree. So I think we just have as a non-Indigenous community, very, very unsophisticated understanding of what community consultation is and the notion of mandates, and that's something that I think can only be improved through education. And that's something, again, we have in the university sector been trying to do that for a number of years in research, but I think it needs to be broader than just research, because universities are still abusing Aboriginal communities in a whole range of other areas besides just research, and so that needs to be more consistent across the university sector, but of course across the country. And all of us as non-Indigenous allies need to be better understanding of what genuine consultation and engagement means, and we've fallen far short, as we saw in the referendum.
Absolutely. Thank you. I guess one of the good things we could say that came out of the referendum was the number of allies that we have, and we can acknowledge around the country. So what advice would you give to leaders and communities who want to commit to reconciliation but don't know where to start? A lot of our, not necessarily our mob, but friends and allies in the community, they're a bit nervous about taking that first step. So do you have any advice on that?
The simple one is, if you firmly believe that there's equality and we're all equal and everyone has the same opportunities, you only have to make a couple of small analyses to blow that to pieces. You can say, okay, from now on we don't have grades of sporting teams. You're all equal. If you're not good enough to get in an AFL team, you don't play. If you're not good enough to have your art in a national gallery and be at the pinnacle, don't paint. When you look at that, there's different levels of acceptance. And there's genres and grades made for that. So let's have an Archibald Prize. Let's have a People's Choice as well. Hang on. That's not equity. You don't have two, you just have one. You don't have state prizes. You're all one. You don't have male sport and female sport. cross-gender sport. You don't have that because we're all equal. So if you have a look at that and try to think that we're all equal, well, you find that equal is when you have the same capacity, the same opportunity. Now, we just talk about physical capacity. If you're actually legislated against, economic capacity, so Aboriginal people weren't allowed to own land, we weren't allowed, my grandfathers. So the very question that was told to me by a very influential family in this town, been asked to many other people, but they said to me, my grandfather came here with a suitcase and made an empire. Why didn't your grandfather? Because for every opportunity your grandfather, who couldn't make it in his own country, came to here for an opportunity, took the opportunity from my grandfather, who had legislated against, that he didn't have the opportunity. So while your grandfather was encouraged, because we're going to build a nation, the nation that was already here was being destructed, dismantled, so that every advantage we have today came at a cost. And what we're saying now, analyse that cost. That's what we're saying. It was not equal by any means. And when it comes to the other part where we're talking equality, I firmly believe if you do any study whatsoever, our systems that existed pre-contact are superior to any system that came on a boat. Any system. Our education system was superior and free, and it was inclusive. Our health system was that superior that we had genetics, forerunners in genetics, that you could not marry back into your family if you followed the bloodline to 6 generations. That is the ultimate in genetics. Get the bloodline right, the children are healthy. We never had such things as orphanage. We had a justice system that was built on respect with the grandmothers. The grandmothers ran the processes. If something went wrong in a family, I did something wrong, my grandmother would know. So if she knew I done up to it, and we're the only ones that had justice system that went and said, yes, I did it. Didn't have to go to a court system, we owned it, because if I didn't own it, my grandmother would, and she'd take the punishment. And I'd be disrespected in my family. So we had systems that I can talk to you about now for 3 hours alone, and codes that existed that were superior because we didn't have the jails, the hospitals, the orphanages, the diseases. We didn't even have warfare here. No such thing as war. We had skirmishes, disagreements, but they were settled within 2 weeks. And we had a system to settle it. So you can see when the settlers came with ignorance and arrogance and saying, we are superior thinkers than you. We come from a place where we've got destruction, isms, racism, sexism. We come from this place where we're going to tell you that we're smarter than you and we're going to build a smarter society. Well, it's taken 200 years to think, hang on, the hospitals are getting bigger, the jails are getting bigger, the courts are getting filled, we're getting sicker. If we're getting smarter, why aren't we getting smaller in those numbers rather than larger? So the answer is Indigenous knowledge worldwide, not just here. Indigenous knowledge had it. Because Indigenous knowledge is about the collective and the good of the community. The Western sense is about the individual and the dollar that comes with it. It's commercial, that's true. So you can see the challenges we have. That's, I don't want to go on too long with that because as Andrew said, we're at a university, we don't lecture you. The difference between our thinking and your thinking is that in our culture, we teach people how to think. The Western culture teach people what to think.
Yeah, and my advice to people wanting to engage in reconciliation, I've got a lot of requests from organisations saying they want to develop a RAP, and my first question to them is why? What's their why? What are they wanting to develop a RAP? And it's not surprising many of them don't have answers to that. It's possibly because they want to get a government procurement contract or they're trying to keep up with their competitors. That's not a reason to develop a RAP. So you have to have a good reason. This isn't just an organisational law. You have to have a good reason as an individual why you're wanting to get engaged. So that's, I think, ask yourself as an organisation or individual, what's your why? The other thing is to be humble. I think the most scary thing is when non-Indigenous people jump into this and then they think they can become the saviours and they'll fix the problem. There might have been still things going on for 200 years, but they'll be able to fix it. And Stephen Hawking once said the most dangerous person is someone with a little bit of knowledge and think they've got a lot of knowledge. And you see that all the time. In leading raps at universities, it's often the people who are just out and out hostile. As much as you can't stand those people, you know where you stand with them. It's the ones that say, yeah, they've been on one cultural competency course and then they're going to fix the whole place. You know, at a previous university, I got contacted by someone in the marketing team who had a great idea, and it was to recruit a non-Indigenous artist to paint an Indigenous themed mural, whatever an Indigenous themed mural is, on the side of the Indigenous building, and she wasn't going to consult with any Indigenous staff. And she asked what I thought, and I'm going, oh my God, that's just ticking every single box. So we managed to stop it, but not before the Vice-Chancellor at the time said to me, this isn't anything to do with self-determination or reconciliation, it's about making the university look better to international students. So, to me, if that's not an example of performative reconciliation, I don't know what it is. But see, that person, the marketing team, genuinely thought that was going to be a good idea. And I think one of the things, I did a big research project a few years ago at another university, and we had about 500 responses, so it was quite interesting. And we mapped their level of cultural engagements, and so it could have been going to do a cultural competency training, or seeing an Indigenous lecture, or doing a cultural event, or seeing a welcome to country, a whole range of different activities. And then they also self-rated their level of cultural understanding, their level of cultural competence. And what was fascinating was no correlation at all between the type of activities and their level of self-identified level of cultural competence. No correlation at all between the type. The correlation was between the number. So it doesn't matter what type of activity they did. If they did a number of them, their level of cultural understanding and empathy and humility would increase significantly, because they got to see more and more of what they were talking about, not just the once-off. And so for anyone who's got a rap out there and your rap says, you know, staff need to do an introduction session of 1 hour or 3 hours or whatever at the start of their career, and then that's it, it's not going to do a thing. You've got to have ongoing training in a whole range of different areas. So, yeah, if people are wanting to get involved, I'd say you've got to be in for the long haul and be genuine, be humble, and know you've got a lot to learn. I'm learning all the time, you know, I make mistakes all the time. And that's not so fine, obviously you've got to try to not make mistakes, but you need to know you're on a journey and working with people and then using your knowledge to help educate other non-Indigenous people. I think working within your own sphere of influence is critical, because we saw, again, back to that campaign, it just exploited, the no side exploited the ignorance in the Australian community so significantly.
Thanks, Andrew. Just one final question before we open it up for some a couple of questions from the crowd. Just looking forward, what gives you hope as we move towards 2029 and beyond? Just 2029 is a bicentennial year, so just in case you didn't know that.
We all know there's two things you can't buy. One is time, the other is emotion. I firmly believe that gatherings like these, and thank you very much for turning up, it's fantastic. It gives that time, because we spend a bit of time here, it may only be a couple of hours. That's how our life is gauged, by our time. Born X, this is your next birthday, all that sort of thing. So we don't take time for granted. So every time I catch up with someone, there's an energy as well. We don't take the energy for granted. And I firmly that as time is changing with the rest of young generations, and I firmly believe the energy is changing. So that again, I'm optimist, but I'm a firm believer in spirituality. I have no curses on anyone or dislike anyone, and I can tell jokes, and like most people, if you'd asked me questions when I was in my 20s, I knew everything. But, and bless people in 20s, because you do know everything at that time. But when you get older, we think, hang on, there's some things I don't know. And you learn to say no, and well, I don't know that, and I'll get the answer for you by someone I do know. So that's what I've found being gathered over there, is the collective consciousness is very important. And when I was quite younger, the collective consciousness that I had was amongst us as Aboriginal people. Now I can see it as us as the collective of people. So we don't stand here tonight or sit here tonight together as a collective of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. We stand as the collective of people. And as a collective of people, we want some truism. We'll analyse your own perspectives of our perspective. We're given our perspectives. You may agree or disagree or take pieces off. Share those that you think should be shared and have a good laugh with those you think, no, he's dreaming. And that's life. And I think that's the beauty of it, because living is not in rooms like this. It's not in the boardroom offices. It's in the lounge rooms. It's in the social activities. It's those incidental ones that makes a huge difference, because you're not being solicited to have an opinion. You're actually given it because you're informed, and you're getting information from different sources. And I'm up to challenge for my information, and up to be challenged, because that's healthy to be challenged. So I think the future is, to me, again, being optimistic, I think it's quite bright. And I think as Australians, when they look at the world now, they see that we're in a very good place and we're going to keep it good. And why is it a good place? Because it's a place of spirituality. And if you believe in the spirituality, everything else will fall into line.
I definitely agree that the youth give us hope, but also the elders as well. Like Uncle Richard said earlier tonight about looking at how we've sort of engaged in past eras as well, and to see how we've progressed in different areas. And I was thinking of Auntie Dr. Jackie Huggins, a really close friend of mine. She's got the honour that she sits on the board, advisory board of the National Centre. And Jackie's been involved in reconciliation for 5 decades. And I remember speaking to her just after the referendum, and you know, people talk about reconciliation was dead. You remember that first week after the referendum, people saying reconciliation is dead. And I understand that sentiment, I really do, because it was pretty down and depressing afterwards. But she just talked to me, and I've had the privilege of talking to a number of other elders since, who've had that experience and that have been around for many, many decades, and to say that, to talk about all the ups and downs that have happened, but there has been that progress since. And of course, you know, I'm not saying at all that the 23 referendum result was a blip. That was a major, devastating outcome for what happened. But there's a lot of good things that's still going on. So I do firmly believe that we'll get there. We will get voice, treaty, and truth. We will implement the rule of state from the heart, and we will have some standard reconciliation. It's going to take a bit longer, but it will get there because we now have a treaty process going on in Victoria. We now have a treaty signing process. We will have a treaty in Victoria by the end of the year, when the rest of Australia sees that we've got a treaty. And it won't just be a statewide treaty, it'll be a series of local treaties. The Djajarurong people in central Victoria have signed up, the first traditional owner group has signed up today with the Treaty Authority to formally declare their interest in pursuing a direct treaty with the Victorian government. And that's going to happen across the state. There'll be 32 other local traditional owner groups that will do that as well. That's really exciting, and to see this, and you know, putting it in context, you know, it's been a treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand since 1840. Treaties in the United States and Canada have been around for hundreds of years. We've never had something like that. We were nowhere near it many years ago. Back in the 70s and 80s, there was a campaign, a very strong push for a treaty. Bob Hawke in 1988 promised at the Brunga Festival, there shall be a treaty. Most people remember Bob Hawke's comment that there'll be no child living in poverty by 1990. Well, the other one he said was there'd be a treaty by 1990, and that never happened. And that's when reconciliation started, by the way. So there's been a lot of missteps in the past, but we will have a treaty, at least in Victoria, by the end of the year, and that's something we have hope for as well.
First of all, thank you both very much for your commentary. It's been really interesting. Just going back to the referendum, unfortunately, one of the things that it's pretty obvious in the post-mortem is that the no case had some pretty serious money and interests behind them that were really pushing the disinformation, as you say. And while there was some corporate backing for the Yes campaign, which was probably more public than it was substantial, the no case you had, I mean, Gina Reinhardt's an obvious example, but you also had a network of mining companies through the Atlas Foundation that was pretty substantial. And in 2023, they would have been really very pleased with themselves, and they haven't gone away. And so to that extent, when another push or another sort of move for a substantial change comes around, whether it's negotiating or indeed implementing a treaty, for example, how do you think people should be prepared to anticipate and deal with some of those interests kind of moving into place and really starting with the disinformation and the outright negative campaign?
Probably two answers. You do something wrong when the consumers don't underestimate their power. A la, some of the, we don't want to mention my names, you blow a place up that people are talking about, your rating goes down. The consumer is a powerful force, and also governments realise it's not only consumers powerful, but the numbers, the voting sectors are very powerful, and so I think there's two things, and you put it beautifully, that people don't see what's happened in the investment into it for the outcome. But the measurements are, okay, we said no, but how is it better? And we're holding you accountable now to make it better, because you're saying, you can't do it. We can do it better. Well, show us how. You haven't done it for 200 years at the moment. How much longer is it going to take to say, listen to another voice? My opening statement before, when I said before about the systems that we have in place, they're better for all of us. If we had less kids in custody, it's fantastic for all of us. Less people sick, we all don't want to be sick. It's not just saying us Aboriginal people want to be the healthiest and most wealthiest people in the world. No, it's the collective. We've got a decent place. It's about that decency. So I think that's the one. The other one, I was a little bit different to the referendum myself. I wasn't disappointed. So I was disgusted more than disappointed. Simply because we knew that when you didn't have bipartisan, you got a problem. We knew that was a challenge. But at the same time, while the referendum was going on, I lost 2 first cousins, a sister, 2 aunties, and an uncle. Do you think I worried about which white fella's going to vote for me or not? I was concerned more about this. When the early settlers came here, when they actually started killing our people and shooting, and that's history now, do you think we're concerned about going to get revenge on them? No, we're concerned about burying our people first. Our concern is people first. What happens next? Because it's completely new to us. It was new to us. The other thing I'm very wary of, and I don't want to make this as a political statement because it's just a fact. Australia is becoming more and more of a multicultural society. So people are coming now, I think it's nearly 1 in every 3, if not that close, are the parents are born outside of Australia. So they're coming with another perspective. And they're saying, when they look at the Indigenous issues here, going, wow, this has got access to the Incas, back to the Pharaohs' processes. We've got the ancient knowledge. This is the Latin of Rome. Still in the knowledge system here, they can actually function and make it a better society. So I think that's where we're appealing to. We're not appealing to, poor bugger me, give us a go, we need it. We're saying, we've got systems that can contribute, come and talk, get those people in that area, so we get the best of both worlds. Yes, engineers are here, but if you're looking at how people want to have as a society, safety, belonging, making sure that there's a balance of nature, that's what we're the masters at. We're not the master builders of bridge, we're not the best jail builders or hospital builders, but we are builders of communities and societies, because we have those structures that everyone is interlinked with each other. So I think that's the challenge, and everything you mentioned before, the answer to that was because of a commercial gain. They see a threat to their commercial viability. And so I think that's always going to be a challenge. People are always going to be commercially challenged.
Yeah, it is a really concerning thing, because if you remember back in the 1990s when Keating was developing the Title Act in response to the Margot decision, and those appalling ads that were coming out about Margot was your backyard safe, and that fear over losing the land, that was played out in the referendum 30 years later by the same vested interests. In Victoria, there was a fraudulent letter circulated by bad actors, fraudulently claiming it was signed by one of the representatives from the First Purpose Assembly Victoria. This was done in Western Victoria, saying once we get the voice, we'll take your land. So with all that focus, so there's that sort of very strong synergy, and you can see that today. What's the group called? Advance. I mean, they were very much prosecuting some very right-wing agendas during the referendum campaign, during the latest election campaign as well. And I think one of the board members of Melbourne Storm is one of the directors of Advance, and there's no coincidence there that Melbourne Storm is now back very much away from doing regular welcomes to the country. So yeah, I think it's a real challenge, and I think one of the ways to address that is to have that truth in legal advertising laws that we desperately need, because it's just people can literally make up lies. You would not get away with that in other forms of advertising, but for some reason you can do it in political advertising.
And just a point on the welcomes. With the welcomes we do, every welcome that I do, and I can speak for myself and my family, I say, only you can welcome when you do get a request. There's no demand, no command, no say this is legislation to welcome. It's about respect. And if you don't have any respect and you don't want to welcome, or you don't think, that's fine, that's your call. Because it came out of people saying, well, we want to have spiritual respect and connect. Not saying, and there's been some people in our side, in the Aboriginal side, who's went and make big different statements, and they do it from their perspective, which is misunderstood. So it's that purely understanding of what does a welcome mean. It's just a blessing of an event from those who have 2,000 generations of connections to the location. Simple as that. No complex. Not saying this is my place now, I'm going to do a welcome, but you're not allowed to go back to your house in Mosman Park or Bassendean. It's not about that.
And it's so, oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's it.
It comes back to lack of education. Like Peter Dutton and other Conservative leaders who were criticising welcomes to country, in some of their remarks it was clear they didn't actually understand the difference between welcome to country and knowledge of the country. It was really clear how they phrased it. They had no idea what the difference was. And so that lack of education and people also, I think, in reading, I try to read some of these, posts and just to see what people are trying to understand. And, people often see that a welcome country is being welcome to Australia, and they don't understand what welcome. They just see the word country and think that means Australia. I live in Australia. Will you welcome to my own country? That sort of thing. Well, that's not what probably most people here are aware. That's not a welcome countries at all. So, no.
The other thing I like to put, which is a challenge, and I'm willing to be challenged even tonight, no, but Australians are generic. Noongar specific. I am specific here. My mother is a Noongar. Her mother's a Noongar. From 2,000 generations, I can go specific Noongar. One of my grandmother's Yamaji, so I've got Noongar Yamaji connect. And that's it. I can't speak for Koori, Wongai, or any other group. We are specific. Whereas non-Aboriginal world, it becomes generic. And I can say you're generic because you can go and stand for elections in a place where you don't live. We might have even spent time, but you're placed in an opportunity and you're going to speak for this group where you don't even live there. That's not specific. That becomes generic. So I just want to, make those little comparatives of why this is important. And I remember when we first did a couple of welcomes, and I was in Melbourne, one of the other football matches, and the people saw our welcome over here and says, "Oh, could you do a welcome for us over here?" It's not my country. "Oh, but you're Aboriginal." Yeah. "Aren't you all Aboriginals?" "No, it's oh, so what's the difference?" And the challenge is we're blessed here because we sort of have two teams. So I'm sort of a Docker, and two friends of mine, a cousin of mine, are sort of Eagles. And there's a connector there. So Vivian Hanson's granddaughter played, and her granddaughter's married to one of the players, so she's got a specific. And Simon Forrest is connector, so there's a connection as well, so that respect goes out. So you can see that. Whereas in Melbourne, you've got more teams. You're going to have okay, who's from this area?
There's only one team in Melbourne. That's the rest of the pretenders.
Yeah. We won't go into it. I can't argue that they got more cups than free medals. So.
You just have time for one more. The gentleman at the back has been waiting patiently.
I'm not sure about that. The gentleman, thank you. My question is about the culture wars, and I don't mean the ones that we read about in Sky News. I mean in the constructs that are used in our referendums and other political discussions. So when I think of blackfellas, people like Richard and Ernie, I think of people who make me laugh. I think of people who create, art, music, words, etc. When I think of Australian politics, I think of boring shit, excuse me. And I wonder, given that the whole referendum process flowed out of the statement of the heart, my first question would be, was there enough heart in that campaign? Because I don't think there was. And was there expression in that campaign from the blackfellow side? So I mean dance, music, art, etc. Thank you.
Well, thanks, and this is one of my nephews, and his father-in-law was my big brother and mentor, and taught me a lot of things that I use today, and so I pay respect to John. I believe that a good example of the government system is the government is set up on conflict. It's conflict. You've got a government body and an opposition that's going to challenge everything. So you automatically set up a professional conflict unit, an organisation. And I used to say to people, if us Aboriginal people disagree, we disagree on principle, not on policies that were put in. So you're creating policies and a creative opposition rather than a collective consciousness for everyone. So if there's a wonderful bill that's going to be good for everyone, and you can see it's a common sense thing, the first thing that goes out the window is common sense. And where's the political challenge or gain to this? So that's where the difference in the cultural wars is that there's tiers of culture with us. And we have what we call a true culture that you don't see. Australia does not see the true culture because that's still on country, in the land, in the law, in the practice, where the old people know who's going to say what, who's set where, who's responsible. That is still there. Then we have this next culture, the culture of the contemporary collective. That culture is the medical service, the legal service, the bodies that are corporations that are set up, and they're set up under a legal structure. So you have to conform to a legal structure and not a cultural structure. So a good example of what John's talking about here is that we had a very successful project called Wajima to Rottnest Island. One reason it was successful was Aboriginal-led. That Aboriginal-led process was done by people who were culturally knowledgeable, and we didn't incorporate ourselves. So we could not have any funds, no corporation, not registered under any act or any body. So once we set our terms and conditions and processes up under a cultural construct, then we approached the Department of Premier and Cabinet to put the administrative and bureaucratic process under the cultural construct. Then they would work with us for so long, then they'd been engaged in the Rottnest Island Authority, who had the authority for the island. So then we'd engage them as the third party, not the first, but the third party under our Aboriginal guidance, through the Bremen Cabinet, for them to deliver. But by the time we got to them, it's mapped out. But a government would go to, okay, Rottnest Island, that's the authority job. We want you to draw up a plan, then go and talk to the Aboriginals. Now, don't come and talk to us. Because if you're going to talk to us, you've got to go through the Premier Cabinet system, you've got to follow a system, and that system's going to fail because you've got people who's going to analyse your process who've got no idea what you're talking about. And they're there because they're going to make sure you don't lose any money, you don't make any mistakes, and your minister's protected. That's the difference. And as Andrew says, we make mistakes. That's part of the learning. You don't do it deliberately, you do it out of good intent. So I think that culture, it comes out of good faith first. If you've got the energy and the good faith, that is the driving force for anything. So we as a collective, that we were blessed here in Nyungar country, and I can't speak for any other part of the country. We were blessed because we're very matriarchal. Being matriarchal, our grandmothers had all the say. And still to this day, my elders, aunties, my sisters still have the say. Doesn't mean to say that there's men's business and women's business over right, because there was men's business over here where they had no idea what we're doing. Women's business, we don't want to know. But when it comes to the family, we found that the grandmother held the pillar. Why? Because in our culture, we got two bases for the feminism. One, the land's the mother. It gives birth to everything, so that's the feminine side, being the mother of the land. The other one is we call ngā, which is the sun, which is female. No energy from the sun, no us on this planet, no giving us life. Then the male becomes the water that fertiles the land, right? And the moon, which controls the moods and the water. So that's just our culture and our balance. So that gave us saying, respect that feminine perspective. If you go back through history and you look at all the heroes that were part of it, you find that most of the heroes who are celebrated are war moguls. The generals, the Caesars, the Alexanders. The women who are up there are mostly victims like Joan of Arc. But the righteousness, you can see, I don't want to talk history here and I don't like to that, but you find that those who are led by a feminine part have more of a chance of harmonious existence than the male part. That's just my small analysis. But we had our grandmothers that took care of everything for us. Now I firmly believe that when the Australia set up as a colony, we have no grandmothers on the Parliament system. We're starting to get grandmothers in there now, and what have the Liberals found out they're missing a lot of? It's only taken them how many years? You need the women in this debate. And I'm not advocating that because it's not a women, that's a women, but I'm advocating for us men, we need the women there. So that's probably my good way to finish off my conversation.
I'll just quickly add to that. In terms of the clash of cultures in the referendum, I think there's probably a bit to still be written about sort of dichotomy between the campaign to create the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which is Indigenous led, 250 people at Uluru, as I said, the largest consultation ever. And remember, underpinning that summit at Uluru in May 2017 was 13 regional dialogues held across the country. So that was all Indigenous led. But then, of course, the referendum was prosecuted by the Albanese government once the Dutton opposition and the Nationals came out, and as we both talked about, the lack of bipartisanship meant it became very much a Labor-led campaign, and there was, I think, a lot of challenges between those two different groups. So I think that the campaign made some mistakes. I mean, if you remember when the Nationals opposed it, and then over that whole summer, the Yes campaign didn't, led by Albanese, didn't engage much over summer, and a lot of momentum started to occur. So that shift of 60% yes to 40% yes started to occur during there. Whoever was the genius that decided that they'd get corporates on board and then chose Qantas, 2 years after, the COVID cases where half of Australia, I think, has got legal action against Qantas for, reneging on their flights, that really didn't go down too well. So I think the campaign had a lot of mistakes. But I think a lot of it was, the Albanese government did commit to it, didn't prosecute the argument very significantly, particularly once the opinion polls started going against them. So I think there's some practical issues there as well for potential referendum for next time. I mean, you go back to 1999, there was major problems with the Yes campaign for the Republic as well. And here we are 26 years later, we're still waiting for a Republic campaign. So it is heartbreaking to know this won't come around again for a while. But I think in the meantime, we have to educate ourselves as a reconciliation movement to educate our communities and our spheres of influence so that whenever something like this comes out again, the community is not going to be misled by the lies and deceptions that characterise the no case in the referendum.
I think the other thing to remember that, going back to karma, as the last word for karma, Dutton's not there opposing anymore.
No.
Didn't take us to get him out. So that karma always comes around, doesn't it?
Yeah. That's a great way to finish.
So I get the honour to close the evening. I've known Richard for about 15 years, and I'm always awestruck just at his generosity, his wisdom, and his sense of humour as well. He brings the whole package, when he's here. So it's really great to see you here tonight, Richard, and also Andrew as well for coming over from. We'll have some fights about Hawthorne because I'm with Richard on this one. It's definitely the Dockers, mate.
Yeah,
we'll
speak slowly for him.
So Andrew, and thanks for your speech at the start and kind of reflecting on your book and stuff as well. And for Donna for chairing the event as well, and for Molly, where's she moved to? Oh, right here, moving around. For welcome us to Forest Hall basically, and the Forrest Research Centre as well, Forrest Research Foundation for this evening. And the word tonight was kind of reflections, and just as a small token of our guest, we have a little notepad for you so that if you want to write reflections, write words of wisdom, write songs or whatever, basically, you have something to kind of put those reflections into. So thank you very much, everybody. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
And I can take it home on the plane. It's really annoying when you get bunches of flowers or something. That's not going to travel on the plane.
Yeah. So. Look, we've got some time afterwards to socialise. Andrew has brought some copies of his book with him.
Can I just say that these are normally a bit of a plug here. Normally $34.95. They're $20 tonight only. But all the proceeds go to a First Nations PhD scholarship we've established at the university. That's on truth telling, which I think we saw in Indigenous countries.
So, and for academics in the room, $20 is a bargain. You know what it costs to buy an academic book these days? It normally comes in a hard copy.
Yeah.
This is a nice,
Yeah.
you know, tactile book, easy to travel, and lots of inspiration.
You should
inside.
have
So, and thank you to everybody for coming out tonight. There's a number of familiar faces in the room and a lot of new faces. We really kind of appreciate you coming out tonight. And, you know, as Richard says, go well into the night and back home after you've had some time to socialise. So thank you.